All right, Brian, you ready? Let's get started and see if we can drag in a few extra fans as we proceed.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay, you're interrupting my view of the audience here. All right, so this year the Reds celebrate their 150th anniversary, and it traces its way back to the 1869 Red Stockings. And so Mr. Erardi and Mr. Gajus and I, John Erardi, longtime sports writer for the Cincinnati Enquirer, twice named Ohio Sports Writer of the Year, author of a number of Cincinnati Reds books, and Greg Gajus, who's been a longtime baseball researcher and has written some articles, and this is his first book. So the three of us combined to do this book, a tribute to that 1869 Red Stockings team. So let's get started with slide number 1. And the flash bulbs are going off because that team truly does deserve to be celebrated for 3 reasons. Any of one would be worth celebrating, but put all 3 together and you really have a team that historically is very significant. So the first reason we remember that team is because they launched the professional baseball revolution, which ushered in a whole new era of baseball. Prior to that, almost all players were amateurs. There were a few paid players, but for the most part, it was all hush-hush and under the table. What the Red Stockings did was put every player under contract. They had signed a contract, and they guaranteed you a paycheck. And no other team had really done that for the whole team. And when the Red Stockings had all the success that they had in 1869, going through the season undefeated, every other team began to look at the way they were doing things and said, I think they got something here. So that team really set the model for what was to come. Secondly, turn around and push the pointer in the wrong time. That team played on both coasts in the same season. You think about that, 1869, 4 years after the Civil War, they traveled by train all the way to the East Coast, all the way to the West Coast, and played literally coast to coast in the same season. And so they helped take what was a game that was popular in the Midwest, very popular out east, and helped transform it into what we often refer to as the national pastime. And thirdly, this team debuted the modern look, the look of the Red Stockings uniform with the short pants, the long stockings. That was the team that started that trend, fashion trend, and that it was immediately copied. Just within a couple of years, all the top clubs were using this same style. So they were fashion setters as well, and really that's been the style in baseball, still is to some extent. Some guys wear their pants long now, but many of the players still wear them short. So that was a style that persisted and helped make that team so famous. And as you can see by that little transition there, this is the cover of the book, and this is the photograph from which it was taken from. The gentleman who did the artwork is a local Cincinnatian, and took that original photograph and translated it into our cover art. One of the questions we always get is, how much did those guys get paid? Well, these are salaries for about 8 months, 9 months out of the year. They did not get paid. This was their salary scale. And you can see the stars on the team were making close to $2,000. And the other guys on the team, by and large, were making a little bit less than $1,000. The payroll, the whole payroll, was a little under $10,000 for the entire team. Now, how did that compare? A regular working laborer in the city of Cincinnati in 1870 was making about $600 a year. So they were paid, a little more. I mean, they were paid generous salaries, but certainly not to the extent that the baseball salaries have skyrocketed today. And if you think that Mr. Allison, if you go down the list, you get down to the bottom and there's Allison, the catcher. And if you think he got overpaid, this is a picture of his hands later in life as he aged, his hands, broken fingers, gnarly fingers. This is what happens when you catch barehanded, because it was barehanded baseball in 1869. They hadn't invented gloves yet, so you played barehanded. And as the catcher, you're standing, near home plate, and you're very susceptible to injuries. So May 1869, 150 years ago this month. Why was it so late? They didn't play games in April. They started in May. That was because there were no leagues. There were no set schedules. Every team could just schedule games when they wanted to, and the Red Stockings didn't begin their season until May 4th. They played another local Cincinnati team called the Great Westerns, and you will be glad to know there were many ladies present. And that was somewhat of a rarity in that day and age. Mainly it was men that went to the ball games. And so they encouraged ladies to attend. And in fact, if you attended, you got in free. Women were admitted free. They won that game 45-9. And I'll talk a little bit about why the scores were so high. But they won that game 45-9. And then yesterday, May 10th, 150 years ago, they played a team from Fort Wayne, Indiana, and they won that game 86-8. And the newspapers were commenting about the, let's say, subpar fielding of the Fort Wayne boys, and they said that their defensive efforts afforded immense amusement. So we could assume that there were a lot of errors, a lot of drop fly balls, a lot of grounders that got between the legs. And that was all 150 years ago this month. So the rules and customs of the day. If you'd gone to a ball game, the kinds of things that you would have seen. For one thing, as I mentioned before, there were no gloves. There were also very rough fields. They did not play on really smooth, manicured diamonds. They played often on rough fields with higher grass and bumpy, lumpy spots. And so that's what helped lead to all the high scoring as well, because you're having to try to field balls on a rough field with bare hands. Underhand pitching in 1869. I mean, today we're used to seeing guys throw overhand. Back then, they threw underhand. Fouls were not counted as strikes. So if you saw the batter foul off a couple pitches, still doesn't have a strike on him. The game was very fast moving, very high scoring. The Red Stockings in 1869 averaged 42 runs a game. There were very few strikeouts. There were many hits. And so I think you would have really have enjoyed the game because there was a lot of action going on. One rule that was different, very different, was one bounce and you're out. Now today, of course, if a ball goes and pop up, you got to catch it in the air. You got to catch the fly to make the out. And back then, on fair balls, you had to catch it in the air. But on foul balls, you could let it bounce once on the ground and then pick it up on the first bounce. You're out. So balls that were popped up in the air near first base or near third base or around the catcher, oftentimes they just let them bounce once and then grab for an out. And there was no infield fly rule, which just meant that if you were a very smart team, the way the Red Stockings were, you could use that to your advantage to pull off a lot of double plays. And so they were better at that than any other team. Finally, no substitutes. No substitutes. So if you started the game, you were going to finish the game. They were not allowed to substitute. That's also one of the reasons why you only saw 10 or 11 names up there under the salary list, is because there was just no need to keep a lot of extra players. And the pitcher, because it was underhand pitching, he could pitch every game, and you can't take him out of the game as a substitute. If he was having a bad day, you'd go put him out in center field and bring your center fielder in to pitch. So that was one of the things that was very different from today's game. So where did they play? If you wanted to go to a ball game in 1869, this was their little ballpark, little wooden grandstand, and it was located right in front of where Union Terminal is located today, right where the museum center is. Out there where the fountain is and the upper end of that parking lot was where the ball field was. This is another, from another angle, you can see the little bleachers down the side. And in the corner here, this was the clubhouse. Now the teams didn't dress in the clubhouse. They came to the game from their homes in uniform, which would be pretty funny to think, I mean, and the visiting team would dress in the hotel downtown and then come to the ballpark in large horse-drawn wagons. So you'd be walking down the street, oh, there goes some Red Stockings. They got their uniforms on. The ballpark seated about 3,000 or 4,000 people on busy days, big games, when they might have 6,000 to 8,000 people. People would stand in foul ground down the base paths. In June, the ball club went east for the entire month, a month-long road trip. Not like today where you might have a 6-game road trip or maybe an 8 or 10-game road trip. They were gone the entire month of June. And they went up through Ohio and across into upstate New York, into Boston, and then into New York City, and on down to Philadelphia, and on down to Washington, where they won every game on the road trip. And in Washington, D.C., they were entertained at the White House by President Ulysses S. Grant, who, of course, is an Ohio native and grew up about 20 miles from Cincinnati. So this was his hometown boys that he was hosting. On their return home, on July 1st, they were met down at the train station by a huge crowd and a marching band, and they put the boys in wagons and they went all the way, snaking through downtown, a big welcome home party for the Red Stockings. And when they got out to their ball field, they were presented with this 25-foot-long wooden bat as a trophy for having won all of the games, beating all the best teams in the country on the East Coast. Unfortunately, we have no idea where that bat is today, Brian. I'm going to assume that you do not have it somewhere located in the archives of the public library. We're still on the lookout for that. So if you see a 26-foot-long bat anywhere, please let us know. In September of that year, they got an invitation to play games in California. And so they took the new Transcontinental Railroad all the way to the West Coast, where they played half a dozen or so teams in San Francisco, beat them all. They really were not very good teams, but this enabled the Red Stockings to really make their mark nationally and to help spread the gospel of baseball. So at the end of the season, fireworks are worth it because they were 57-0. The highest score in a game was 103 runs. That's a lot of runs. They played roughly in front of 200,000 spectators from coast to coast, and of course here in Cincinnati. All right, that sort of sums up the 1869 season. I'm going to turn this now over to Mr. Erardi, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the personalities on that team and what was going on in the city of Cincinnati. John?
Thank you, Greg. Michael, take your mic. I always say, how's everybody doing? But there's only 3 people to talk to. You said you were from Louisville? Do you still live there? And how about you, man?
We're sisters,
Oh.
but originally Buffalo, New York.
Okay.
Lived in Louisville for years.
I'm
Oh,
from
Buffalo. They played in Buffalo
played
on that
Buffalo.
trip. They played in Buffalo. Oh, no, no.
No, they played,
Played in Rochester.
Rochester.
Yeah, Rochester.
Played in Rochester.
Okay.
So Sally, are you from Chicago? I know you're a Cub fan.
Chicago, yeah.
All right, good. So here's the deal. I'm going to tailor this presentation.
Well,
My
my
3 favorite
parents are
gals in
from
the world.
Louisville.
What's that?
My parents are from Louisville, so yeah.
Say that again?
My parents are from Louisville.
Okay, Louisville. So we got a big Louisville contingent, which is nice because 2 river cities. Gotta make sure I don't fall off the stage like.
Don't fall off, though.
There's not that much. Well, there's plenty of room up here. So I wanted to start with this slide of George Wright. George was the best player in baseball when he came here. He was the brother of the manager, but there was not any case of favoritism because, as I say, they wouldn't have gone 57-0 without this guy. He was just terrific. And in this picture, it's not quite as clear as I'd like it to be, but he's well into his 80s here. He came to town in 1867 to play the Red Stockings, his brother's team, and he did a number on his brother. They won 53-10, and from that point forward, his brother knew George was the best player in baseball, but he said, we'll never win this thing without my brother playing shortstop. So he went out and got his brother in 1869. But George lived until 1937. 3 months after he passed away, he went into the National Baseball Hall of Fame. The first 19th century player to be so honored. But what I find interesting is that in 1988, when we had the All-Star game here, somehow I was able to track down, without Facebook or Instagram or anything, I tracked down his granddaughter, who grew up on his knee basically in Boston. Of course, the team moved to Boston after they left Cincinnati, but it was remarkable to me because here this guy was 22 years old playing shortstop for the Red Stockings in 1869, and almost 100 years later, I find somebody who knows him well, growing up on his knee. So I thought that was wonderful. But before I segue into the next slide, I just want to say that in a library especially, I feel comfortable quoting the author, William Faulkner. I always think I might be a little bit laughed at outside the literary environs when I say Faulkner's best quote, for me anyway, who loves writing history, was, "The past isn't dead, it isn't even past." And the reason I say that is because this guy would very much recognize Cincinnati if he came back here. First, because he lived so long, but secondly, because even when he was in town, there was a lot here in 1869 that's still here, and we'll get into that in a minute. Okay, Greg, next slide. So, you mentioned Louisville. Who's the fastest man? Who's the fastest player? Fastest player you've ever seen? Any sport or anything. Any fastest person you ever saw? Jackie Robinson, that's a good one. Jackie was very fast. I think this guy could have beat Jackie in a foot race. It would have been close. Who knows the name Billy Hamilton? I know Sally does. Former Red center fielder, terrifically fast player, ran the bases in roughly, I figured, home to home. He never really had an inside the park home run, but had he had one, based upon his times for triples and things like that, he would have been about 13.8, 13.9 around the bases. That's 30.1 feet per second. I think he's moving roughly at 20 or 25 miles an hour. This guy, who was the right fielder and was a lawyer for the Red Stockings, he ran home to home. He was timed before a game at 14.5, so a half a second, maybe 0.6 seconds slower than Billy Hamilton, tremendously fast. So what happened to him was he came to town. He worked in the Supply Corps in the Civil War for a fellow named Colonel Moulton, who was a Cincinnatian and a lawyer, and had an office on Main Street, downtown Cincinnati. So he tells this fellow, J. William Johnson, you know, J. William, you're a good ball player. Originally you were born in Wales, and then you moved to Maryland. You wanted to be a minister, but then you became a lawyer. Well, why don't you finish up law school at Harvard, where you're going now, and come to Cincinnati and transfer to the University of Cincinnati Law School, because I know you love playing baseball, and I got a great team here in Cincinnati you might want to play for. Sure enough, J. William Johnson transfers from Harvard to UC. His first year as a law student is 1867 in Cincinnati. He plays for the Red Stockings of Harry Wright. Then in 1868, he graduates law school. I was going to say he passes the bar. I'm not convinced there was a bar test and a bar exam in 1868. There might have been, but he winds up playing for Harry in 1868. And then that same year, this team goes to New York, and they go 10-4. Nothing like their big road trip a year later, but in 1868, that was a heck of a team. They beat some good teams. They beat the defending champion, if I recall, in New York City. And this guy was a part of that. And the day he died, 75 years old, had 4 kids. The obituary read that he was the fastest guy in baseball at one time. Well, Greg Gajus found out, in fact, he was the second fastest, but that's a pretty cool thing to be remembered for in your lawyer when you had all his accomplishments at the bar. Next slide, please. Here we go. This is Cal McVeigh. Now, you mentioned the great Muhammad Ali, the Muhammad Ali Center. This guy was a boxer. He was born in Iowa. He later moved to Indianapolis. And Greg Gajus pointed out to me that he was the first major leaguer born west of the Mississippi. And if you think about it, he might have been the first major leaguer who ever attended college, because if he was the first born west of the Mississippi, and he was one of the first players, first professional, he went to Butler University. At the time, it was named Northwest Christian School. And at one time, I think 10 years later, a gentleman in Indy named Ovid Butler contributed a bunch of land, and they decided, you know what, to heck with this Northwest Christian, we'll just call it Butler University. And sure enough, I think the reason that Harry loved this guy so much, again, farm boy and a boxer, I think the reason Harry liked him was that he was a really strong guy. He was a tremendous pugilist. So there were some tough teams in baseball in 1869, and I think Harry just liked having a guy who could comport himself in a potential fracas. This guy was the guy. He was a really good player, good hitter, and I would argue probably should be in the National Baseball Hall of Fame as well. Next slide, Greg. Okay, I like to refer to Bertha as my sweetheart. Now I notice I got 3 sweethearts today in the audience, which I really like. 4, but we don't count Brian because, first of all, he's not my sweetheart, he's not a woman. But what I like about this gal, she didn't design, but she seamed the Red Stockings uniforms. She lived just east of the Union grounds, which Greg pointed out earlier, and she was in the employ of a fellow named Luther T. Barwise, who had a tailor shop at 4th and Main in Cincinnati, downtown. So when Harry had the idea, well, let's come up with a new uniform, I'll go see my friend Luther T. Barwise and see what he can put together. Well, this is the seamstress, and Luther Barwise commissioned Bertha to make the first uniform. She was born in Bohemia, which is now Czechoslovakia. Her husband was born in Germany. He served in the Civil War, and because he served in the Civil War, he was granted automatic U.S. citizenship. So he lost his arm at the famous Battle of Antietam, which was in Maryland, and still is to this day the bloodiest day in U.S. military history. So again, he lost his arm. He died at age 39, and Bertha lasted another 44 years. She died in 1912, and the day she died, or the day after she died, the headline in the Enquirer read, if I can find it very quickly, Red uniform maker of the victorious team of '69 passes away. So she basically took that accomplishment in her life all the way to the grave. It was quite famous, and it shows you how famous that 1869 team, if they were still talking about it in 1912. Next slide, please. Okay, so what I want to point out here, and of course I've got to use my laser because even though I'm tall enough to reach this, I want to use this laser. Suspension Bridge. Miss Louisville, do you know about the Suspension Bridge? Either one of you? Do you have what's your most famous bridge in Louisville?
The oldest.
The oldest.
Might be L&N.
Could be.
David L&N.
Could be. Well, this particular bridge was built, it started actually before the Civil War, but it opened in December of '66 to pedestrian traffic only. So by the time George Wright, who I showed you earlier, would have come to town as a visiting player in 1867, it was up. And that's Vine Street, our main street. I think the library, Sally, is it not on Vine?
Yep.
That's Vine.
It's the geographic division of the city, east-west.
Exactly. Vine does now separate the city east-west, but back then, I've learned that Main Street separated the city. And you later see a map that we did of the city. But to the point I was making earlier about George Wright being familiar with this city, that Suspension Bridge he sure as heck would recognize if he came back today. And he would probably marvel at the fact it was still around. And probably marvel at the fact that we're doing a program on the 150th anniversary of his famous team. But that was called the Basin. Back then, you can well imagine that we didn't have the inclines of the 1870s. We obviously didn't have cars, so we had a lot of people into this chokehold of a city, the Basin. Basically, lower Mount Adams all the way to where the team played on the west end, right on down to the river. That would have been called the Basin. We were the second most congested city in America. What do you think was the most congested, Sally? Most congested city in America? Very good, Manhattan. So that's a lot of people in a very small area. All right, next slide, please, Greg. Okay, this is the map we did. I was referring to the, I want to look at my phone real quick to make sure I'm okay on time. Yes, I am. Okay, so, yeah, thanks, Greg. So this map, by the way, which is on sale for around town, various places for 25 bucks. I don't expect anybody to buy it today, but if you do, it's 15. But the point of the matter is, in talking about this very cool map that my daughter did, is that, just think about it. We pointed out the suspension bridge, right? This was Sawyer Point. Now, the Louisville gals may not know Sawyer Point, but Sally would know. That's one of our big parks. It's on the river, just outside downtown. That is what was the Little Miami River, Little Miami Railroad Depot. That's where the team left for the famous road trip in 1869. Look at some other places around town. Immaculata Church, Christian Moorline Brewery, which is now Rheingeist, Finley Market. The Union Grounds is at the Union Terminal now, where the museum center is. The Mercantile Library was across the street from the Gibson House, our famous hotel. Mercantile Library is still around. Washington Park, great park, still going strong. This was St. Paul's Episcopalian Church, and it is now Taft's Ale House. Arnold's Bar and Grill, still going strong. So there's a lot here that George would have recognized. Eden Park, of course. The reservoir wasn't there then; it was under construction, but just a lot here. So even though everybody was in this area called the Basin, George would definitely recognize it. Hey, to come back. Next slide, Greg. Okay, good. You know what? Can you punch that back? I just wanted to point out, we'll work on our technical program. I know, okay, I didn't notice the C's earlier, but the X's, the red X's mark where the players lived. So I just want to point out some things. Asa Brainerd, the pitcher, lived very close to the Taft Museum of Art, which is still going strong. George and Harry Wright lived near the ballpark. By the way, that's where Bertha lived. That was Charlie Gould, the Cincinnati native. Fred Waterman, the third baseman, who lived near his 3 blocks away from a cigar shop at 6th and Vine. And by the way, Asa had a cigar shop as well. He was roughly at 4th and Main, just next door to the Gibson House. 4 of the players lived at a place called the Hummel House. It was a boarding house across from the courthouse. The courthouse is still there. Hummel House is no longer there, but the left fielder, the catcher, the right fielder, and the second baseman all lived together. And they lived with a bunch of other guys, and apparently the lady was a great cook because she cooked for about 14 guys, and she kept them well fed. They would have enjoyed it. Okay, I think we're ready for the next slide now, Greg. Okay, so this is the canal. Now, in Louisville, did y'all have a canal running through town? I mean, I don't think you did, because we had a canal that ran all the way from the Ohio River. Ran from Lake Erie down to the Ohio River, all the way from Toledo. And this would have been what is now Central Parkway, which is roughly, 11th Street, something like that. So my point is that this would have come all the way down from, again, Toledo, but it would have run by, we showed earlier, it would have run by the Christian Moorline Brewery, and across from the Christian Moorline Brewery was a Procter & Gamble factory where they made soap and candles. And I've been told that Procter & Gamble could not have been founded anywhere but Cincinnati, because we had the big pork population, if you will, and got a lot of wax made wax from that for the candles, and we had a great river system, obviously. So anyway, my point being that the barges came all the way from Toledo down past P&G, Finley Market, got to what is now Central Parkway, hung a left going east, and then shot down Eggleston, Sally, you know Eggleston, all the way down to the river. But this is one of my favorite pictures in the book, just because there's Mount Adams, wasn't too populated back then. I think that's Race Street. This building's still there today. It is American Automobile Association. American Automobile Association. Next slide, please, Greg. Okay, another one of my favorite pictures in the book. This is the Canal Market. at one time was known as the Canal Market, later became Court Street Market. This is roughly, I was told today by one of my researcher friends that it was probably in the late 1880s, because the ladies are wearing bright colored blouses. Wouldn't have seen that in 1869. Straw bowler hat wouldn't have been around until the 1880s. Derby was around probably in 1860, but this was a block and a half from the Hummel House, as I mentioned to you. And there were 7 markets in the basin in downtown Cincinnati. This is basically where you got your meats and your fruits and your veggies. Didn't have supermarkets. Would have a lot of corner stores, but your big markets that got the great produce in from the Great Lakes and the rivers would have been in places like this. Okay, next slide, please, Greg. Okay, and the reason I had Greg bring this map back up is because, again, my daughter did the map, and one thing we learned in doing the map, because we're very familiar, obviously, with the city. I've been here 40 plus years, and my daughter's been here 20 plus years. But one thing we noticed in doing the map, I mentioned the Taft Ale House earlier, that a lot, since then, since 1869, a lot of churches have been converted into bars. But we noticed that no bars have been converted into churches. Thank you. But Sally did not get quite a big laugh as I wanted on that. But
He was silent.
Okay, thank you.
Polite.
There's a silent, but I'm smiling.
Patted.
That's okay. You're laughing inside. That's very good. I'd like to bring up a good friend of mine, key figure in the accomplishment of doing this book, Mr. Greg Gajus. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. I'm going to talk a little bit about the 1870 season. So the 1869 season really made the team legends. But in 1870, they went into the season pretty hopeful. They had gone undefeated. They'd beaten all the best teams. And the manager said, I have the players in far better shape. In fact, during the winter, he took them to the gym and worked them 2-3 hours a day. They were lifting weights, swinging Indian clubs, just working out, getting ready for another long season. And he said that in a letter he wrote that he expected the team to give a good account of themselves and possibly be better than the year before. But at the end of that same letter, Harry Wright said something that was pretty prescient, because he said that that time will show how we do, because as you know, baseball is very uncertain. And anybody that watches baseball knows that it's very unpredictable how one game will go, how the season will go. So the team started out, they went south, they had gone to the east, they had gone to the west. They went south to New Orleans to play a few games, and kind of like the trip to San Francisco, the games weren't very competitive, but it was part of the Reds wanting to spread the gospel of baseball across the country. And then they came back to Cincinnati, played in the Midwest, and before they headed out east again to play the very best teams. And they played a team called the Mutuals, which had a very close game with in 1869, beat them 16-3. And then the next day they played a team called the Brooklyn Atlantics. They were one of the better teams in baseball. The Red Stockings had stomped them like 32-10 the year before. But this game became one of the most famous games in baseball history. There's a huge crowd. The Red Stockings were favored. And it was one of these games that went back and forth. It was tied 5-5 at the end of 9 innings, which in that time was very unusual, but a really well played game with all the errors that you have. And the Brooklyn team was ready to accept a tie, which you could have back then. But Harry Wright said, no, we want to play it out. We're challenging you, and we want to play the game to its conclusion. 10th inning was scoreless. In the 11th inning, the Red Stockings scored 2 runs, and then in the bottom of the 11th, they gave up 3. There was a couple hits. There was an error. There was a play where the Reds' right fielder Cal McVeigh went back into the crowd to try and catch a ball, and a fan jumped on his back. made it a little difficult to make the play. But a couple of hits and an error later, the Red Stockings had lost 8-7. So their long winning streak, which had gotten up to 82 games, was over, and they had finally been defeated. The thing is there's, a lot of people say, well, after that they lost some games and teams lost interest, but they won their next 15 games. So they were actually playing pretty well. But then they got to August, and they started losing or playing close games against inferior teams. They had a game where they were winning 16-8 in the ninth inning and gave up 8 runs for a 16-16 tie. That was a little bit sloppy. And then they lost at home to the Philadelphia Athletics 11-7. So that was their second loss. And at that point, the press started getting restless. They started criticizing the players, talking about their effort. Things were just starting to go a little bit downhill. And in August, several things happened. So another big rivalry that started in 1870, you can go back to that, was our friends from Chicago had seen how successful the Reds were, and they said, we want a team just like that to promote the city. And in fact, they went out and spent $18,000 on a team. And then when the Reds played in Chicago, this ad appeared, and it was kind of basically the start of the Rosie Reds. In fact, they were offering round-trip train tickets to Chicago to go to the game and come back. It took 14 hours each way to ride the train to Chicago in 1870. But that was really the start of a big rivalry. And then in August, a couple things happened. On August 7th, you can go to 2nd, you can go to chapter. So one thing that happened, George Wright, the best player, tore his ACL, or we think he tore his ACL. He basically couldn't play shortstop anymore. He would still play, but he would play positions other than shortstop, and they used courtesy runners back then. So he would stand up there, take a swing, and somebody else would run to first for him because his knee was pretty much shot. So that was a big problem for the team. And then another big event was the two guys who really ran the baseball club that was paying the players, Aaron Champion and John Joyce, suddenly resigned. And it's really not clear why they resigned, whether the discord among the team and the club was part of it, that they had lost a couple games, or Aaron Champion, in fact, had political ambitions and he wanted to run for prosecuting attorney of the city, which he did in October. He lost that election too. But these two guys resigned, and then that really created, some more issues for the team, because the club that was supporting them was now pretty well divided. Thanks. And then the killer was they played the Chicago team. The Chicago team came to Cincinnati and they beat the Red Stockings. Let's see, I believe it was 10-6. And then they went up to Chicago for the return match and lost again. And that really killed the team's chances of repeating as the recognized champion, because they weren't even the best team in the West, having lost to Chicago. The Chicago fans came down to the game here. They were heard in the street gloating. It is the tradition of Chicago fans taking over cities has a long and storied history in the game going back to 1870. And there's really nothing new in baseball. After that, there was a game in late August in Portsmouth. Portsmouth had gotten a professional team, and this might have been the craziest game of the 2 years of the Red Stockings. They were playing a team called the Riverside, who they had beaten 32-3 in May. They took a riverboat down to Portsmouth, and it was one of these games. The Red Stockings took an early lead. It went back and forth. They were playing some sloppy defense. And turns out in the bottom of the ninth, they're behind 27-23. The first two batters for the Red Stockings were retired. So 2 outs, nobody on, down by 4 runs. There's an error. Shortstop for the other team drops a pop-up, couple singles, and then there's a fly ball to left. And it's a close play, the left fielder dives for it, and the umpire calls him out. Red Stockings lose, except that Harry Wright appeals the play. And they asked the left fielder, a gentleman by the name of Huddleston, if he had caught the ball or not. And the newspaper account says Huddleston, with the high sense of honor that should characterize all players, admitted he dropped the ball. So they called it a base hit. And, people were honorable back then, I guess. And the Red Stockings came up with another single, and then their second baseman, named Charlie Sweezy, hit a grand slam home run. 6 runs after 2 out and nobody on to walk off the game 29-27. Huge upset, but the story doesn't end there. On the boat ride back, fights break out, instigated by Sweezy, who had a reputation as a drinker, apparently had gotten hold of some alcohol. It's unclear whether he was fighting his teammates, the passengers, or the crew, or all three. But the club found out about it and suspended him the next day. The day after that, they thought about it. He said he was sorry, it would never happen again, and they reinstated him. So he was back on the team before they had a few more games. But then they lost these games to Chicago, and interest really started to drop, even though they had put a lot of money into new grandstands at the park. And so dissension was increasing. There was kind of cliques between the teams, and they were really a victim of their own success. And at the end of November, the club president sent out this note that basically said, "We have arrived at the conclusion that to employ a 9 for the coming season at the enormous salaries now demanded by professional players," now we're talking $2,500, $3,000, would plunge our club into debt. And the thing is this is the first time owners complained about the salaries for paying professional players, a tradition that has continued for 150 years. But on the other hand, in this case, it was probably true. Because there was so much interest in baseball, so much demand for good players, the Red Stockings were really the victim of their own success, because now players could get much more money for their talents. There was no reserve clause, nothing tying you to a team except the contract you signed that year. So, and then Aaron Champion even said in 1870, baseball does not pay as it used to in those longer glory days of 1869. And so they just didn't think they could make money, and the club did not hire anybody. So, so that was the end of pro baseball in Cincinnati until 1876, when they entered a team in the National League. But it wasn't the end of the Red Stockings. If you look at the old newspapers, which we all did, you can see stories, 1880, 1890, hey, this team's pretty good, but boy, they weren't the Red Stockings of 1869. That was a good team. And in 1919, the Reds made the World Series, and we're playing the White Sox. First time they had won the National League. And in this picture here, this is one of my favorites from the book, they brought back the surviving members of the Red Stockings. 3 guys that were still alive in 1919. They're in the back row there on the left is a guy named Oak Taylor, who was a substitute on the San Francisco trip. In the middle was George Wright, and on the left was Cal McVeigh, the young outfielder. And so they came back, and there's accounts of they went to the first 2 games of the World Series. There's a press account where they talk about Cal McVeigh being impressed by Ivy Wingo, who was the Red Stockings the Reds catcher, who threw out a couple base stealers early in the game. And he said, boy, he did just as well as Doug Allison could have done. And George Wright was really impressed with the play of Ed Roush, who was the star center fielder of that 1919 team. And you know, the interesting thing about baseball, it's pretty easy to have a chain. It just kind of continues. 50 years later, in 1969, Major League Baseball made a really big deal out of the 100th anniversary of the Red Stockings. The baseball logo was developed that year, and every team named an all-time team. And in 1969, the Reds media had a vote, and they named Ed Roush the greatest player in Reds history, who had been watched by George and Cal in that 1919 World Series. And here's a picture of the players that were named to that team. Ted Kluszewski's on there, Bucky Walters. Pete Rose, named as one of the greatest Reds ever in the 7th year of his career. Let's see, that was, but these guys were all there. The other guys that were there included but the other people there, Joe Nuxall was there announcing the game. He was in the radio booth by then. Johnny Bench was playing in the game, as was Tony Perez. Frank Robinson had been named to the team. He was playing for the Orioles at the time. And Ted Kluszewski was named to the greatest Reds all-time team. 7 of the 8 statues outside Great American Ballpark were represented at this game 50 years ago in 1969. And then in 2019, just a week ago, the Reds dedicated the 1869 pavilion. And in that pavilion, there were descendants of the Wrights, George and Harry. Charlie Gould and Aaron Champion were in attendance at this. And, other great Reds were playing in the game. Joey Votto, who is rapidly becoming one of the greatest Reds ever, played in the game against the Braves. Nick Senzel, who knows what we'll think of him 50 years ago, hit his first career home run in his second game as a Red. The Reds won 9-2, 150 years of Cincinnati baseball in 3 days, from 1869 to 1919 to 1969 to last week. You've got 150 years of Cincinnati Reds baseball history. So with that, any questions?
Yes, it is.
My daughter told me that there's not a big parade down here for Red Stockings.
Yeah, on opening day. Every year. Everything shuts down. It's like a holiday.
Yeah.
Kids can, oftentimes kids, if they got a ticket, they get out of school, or their parents will bring them down and watch the parade or something like that. A lot of businesses closed, people get off work. It's a big deal.
Was this the 100th anniversary of that?
Yeah, that was the 100th anniversary, well, of the Finley Market.
Philly Market.
Yeah, there were parades before that. Yeah, 100th anniversary. Yeah. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good.
I just thought everybody loves Raymond because he was a sports writer. So you connect to that.
Yes, I used to have a allergist who always called me Raymond instead. He said, "You remind me of Raymond."
That's across my
So,
mind.
which one
Everybody
was
loves
Raymond?
Raymond.
But that was a good show.
Yeah, I liked it.
It's- Well, of course, it's still going strong, right? Reruns.
Yeah. Come on, sit, it's 3 o'clock.
Hey,
All right,
so-
thanks, guys.
Thanks for
They
coming
did
out.
good. Oh, question.
Yeah.